The last couple of days continue the trend of the situation on the Ukrainian battlefronts being essentially uneventful. Fighting is taking place, but at a very reduced level, and to the extent that I can make much sense of what's happening, it seems that in most places now, the Russians appear to be gradually taking back the initiative. I note that even the Institute for the Study of War in Washington seems to be gradually coming round to that same conclusion, and they, of course, have been tracking the war in great detail, often, I suspect, getting their information from the same Telegram channels that I've been checking. And anyway, their perspective of the war has been radically different from mine. They have been consistently supportive of Ukraine, but even they are finding it difficult, I think, to sustain the narrative that there is an Ukrainian offensive underway and that Ukraine has achieved some kind of breakthrough in various places. Anyway, I would say that the most recent reports, and they've been coming from Western sources, have now, I've noticed, gradually acknowledged that the village of Verbovoye, which had at various times been claimed to be either wholly under Ukrainian control or partly under Ukrainian control, that it is in fact, and apparently always has been, fully under Russian control. If we're looking at the most, shall we say, the part of the battlefront which in the West draws the greatest attention, which is the area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, south of Orekhov, the Russian Ministry of Defense has, for 2 days in a row, claimed that the number of Ukrainian troops killed or wounded in the fighting there is 30. Now, that's a significant number by most estimations, but it is significantly less than what we have seen in the past, even a few weeks ago. And fighting does continue to take place further north. It remains much more intense, for example, around Bakhmut. But here again, there does seem to be an overall reduction in the level of the fighting. So today, for example, on the 1st of October, the Russian Ministry of Defense reports that over the enemy's losses over the past 24 hours have amounted to up to 150 Ukrainian personnel killed or wounded. Again, that is significantly less than the multiples in hundreds, the multiples of that type of number, which we have seen in the past. So one gets the sense of a fighting that is gradually ebbing down, that is scaling down, and that the intense battles of the summer, the high summer of July and August, and even at the start of September, are now well and truly behind us. That the major battle, for example, for Bakhmut, seems to have tailed off. The Ukrainians tried exceptionally hard to capture Kleshevka and Andreevka and Kurdyumovka, and they've never succeeded in capturing and consolidating control of any one of these villages. In fact, the only important gain, as far as I can see, in the Bakhmut area is the one made by the Russians in the north, where they seem to have captured most, though perhaps not all, of Orekhovo-Vasilievka. The Russian Ministry of Defense has still not reported the capture of that village, which makes me think that it continues to be contested. But anyway, even there, the fighting seems to be sort of quietening and ebbing away. But it must be said that the situation remains unstable. It could be that something is going to be prepared. A couple of days ago, as I discussed at length in these programs, there was much rumor and speculation of the Ukrainians preparing some big amphibious assault across the Dnieper towards the Kinburn Spit and further north in Novaya Kakhovka, and that remains a possibility. But so far, it still seems to be fighting for control of various islands in the Dnieper River. And of course, there was more talk on Russian channels about another Ukrainian attack towards to try to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But that also seems to have, for the moment, faded away, and no such attack has happened, though of course one can't assume necessarily that it won't. One thing that I have actually noticed that has really apparently started to change on the battlefronts is that the Russians do seem to be sending more troops, increasing the number of their forces in critical positions on the battlefronts. So, to give one example, there's a report which I believe to be true that some 10,000 extra troops have been sent to the Bakhmut area. These apparently are regular infantry equipped with their BMP-3s and T-72 or T-90M tanks. And further north in the area of Kupiansk, where there is apparently a plan for some kind of major Russian operation, the destruction of the bridges across the Oskol River, strongly points to that. There's also reports that the Russians have reinforced there as well. A couple of days ago, I said, on the basis of certain comments made by the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu at the meeting of the Defense Ministry Board, that the Russian forces near Kupiansk appeared to number no more than 2 brigades, perhaps 8,000 men in total. We've now had a figure which has told us from a Russian source, which tells us that the 25th Combined Arms Army, the force that seems to be concentrated, not so much around Kupiansk, but as I understand it, rather further south, previously numbered 13,000 men, but has now been reinforced and now numbers 17,000 men. So that would suggest that it's increased in size from 3 brigades to 4. Now, why the Russians are now feeding more men into the battlefronts? Well, I don't know. Could be that they're preparing some big move. The 10,000 men that have apparently been deployed to the Bakhmut area do look like they would be enough, certainly to tip the balance in the fighting around Bakhmut and perhaps enable the Russians to press home an offensive. It could be that this is connected with the recent capture or partial capture of the village of Orekhovo-Vasilievka, and that some further advance, perhaps to the next village, Minkovka, the next village in the direction towards Kramatorsk, is now being considered as the next target, but we will have to wait and see. So we continue to see a quiet scaling down of the fighting on the battlefronts. And by the way, the same is true on the Ukrainian side of the war in the air. Now, Ukraine, over the last couple of weeks, launched a succession of missile strikes on Crimea and launched lots of drone attacks against Crimea, of course, but also against the rest of Russia also. Well, those drone attacks, again, seem to have subsided, as have the missile attacks. There's been fewer missile strikes towards Crimea. They do take place, but without apparently achieving very much, and they do seem to be on a significantly smaller scale. And I noticed, for example, that today the Russian Defense Ministry is only reporting one drone attack over the last 24 hours. It reads that on 2nd October 2023, at about 9 a.m., the Russian armed forces thwarted the Kiev regime's attempt to launch a terrorist attack by fixed-wing drones against facilities in the Russian Federation. Air defense systems on alert shot down the Ukrainian drones over Belgorod region. By the way, and for the record, I've noticed that the Russians seem to be bringing more of their old Soviet-era anti-tank guns into play. One particular weapon system that I've seen being used is the S-60 anti-tank cannon gun. It's a 57mm gun. It was developed in the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 1950s, and it was very widely used by the Soviet army in the early period of the Cold War until it was replaced by surface-to-air missiles, and it was widely exported. Many of them were used, for example, during the fighting in Vietnam. The Soviets kept large numbers of these guns in store, and they seem to be redeploying them now to the battlefields. Presumably ammunition has been found for them somewhere, and they would, on the face of it, make a pretty effective weapon for shooting down drones. And I suspect that that is what they're increasingly being used for. Anyway, the Ukrainian drone and missile offensive, at least for the moment, seems also to have run down. The Russian drone and missile offensive has not. The Russians continue to launch large numbers of drones against Ukraine. They're able to target and destroy facilities anywhere they wish over Ukraine. Drone, of course, the preferred drone for use in this way is the Uranium 2, which is built now by that factory in Tatarstan. And of course, from time to time, the Russians also launch heavy cruise missile attacks. And, well, we haven't seen one of those for some days now, but there's no reason to think that one won't be coming. The Russians are able to keep the pressure on Ukraine in the air constant with these very heavy drone attacks, and then they launch cruise missiles, often in large numbers, in one go, in order to basically hit home hard on their chosen targets. So anyway, all of this, as I said, bar this possible strike by Ukraine across the Dnieper and towards the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, is of course consistent with an offensive that is now running out of steam. Ukraine running out of men, running out of machines, probably running out of ammunition, with the Russians reinforcing and perhaps planning something big in the north in Kupiansk. I would reiterate again, a point I've made many times now, if there is going to be a Ukrainian amphibious assault across the Dnieper, that will be Ukraine's last throw. Anyway, what other things have been going on? Because it's important to say that Western governments are now scrambling to decide what to do in light of the fact that this offensive that they'd invested so many hopes in has failed. And one government in particular is now showing signs of extreme stress. In fact, judging from some of the comments that have been coming out of Britain over the last 36 or so hours, one would get the sense that the British authorities, or some of them, are, in the face of the failure of the offensive and in the face of more and more chatter about negotiations between Russia to freeze the conflict, that the British authorities, or at least some of them, are in the throes of some kind of nervous breakdown. Now, yesterday I touched on the British proposal, ideas, which were being floated for British troops to be sent to Ukraine to train Ukrainian troops there, and for the British to play some kind of role in escorting Ukrainian grain ships through the Black Sea. And I mistakenly thought that the comments had been made by the British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. In fact, they were made by the British Defence Secretary, the newly appointed British Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. And I said that on their face, they were incredibly reckless. They came up with some astonishing ideas, that the idea of sending British troops to Ukraine at this time, even with the purported task limited to providing training, that this would be completely unacceptable to the Russians. And of course, within just a few hours of Grant Shapps having made those comments, we had a devastating response from the Russian deputy head of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev. He came out and made a comment in his usual pungent language about the fact that the Russians would undoubtedly retaliate against these British troops, that they would in effect be targets. And he complained that steps towards escalation being made by Britain and Germany, the Germans, for example, considering the supply of Taurus missiles, that all of this was leading towards World War III, that these people, the British and the Germans, didn't seem to have a clear understanding of what they were doing, were taking incredible and reckless risks, and were pushing the Russians in that kind of direction which the Russians didn't want to go to. Anyway, probably, partly in response to those words by Medvedev, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak then issued a clarification. It's a very inadequate clarification, but anyway, he said that what Grant Shapps was doing, he wasn't really talking about the British becoming directly involved in the conflict. Rishi Sunak was careful to reassure everybody that that is categorically ruled out, and instead he said that this was just a plan to be discussed in the future once the conflict is over. At that point, of course, British troops might go to Ukraine and start training Ukrainian troops there. And Rishi Sunak didn't really explain, at least not to my satisfaction, what in that case Grant Shapps meant by the protection for the grain ships. Anyway, few hours, short time after that comment by Rishi Sunak appeared, we then started to get a series of comments made principally to the Daily Telegraph by Grant Shapps' successor, the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, who was one of Ukraine's most forceful, fervid supporters within the NATO system. And first of all, Ben Wallace told the Telegraph that he had urged Rishi Sunak, after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, to allocate £2 billion more of British taxpayers' money to supporting Ukraine, that Rishi Sunak apparently declined this. And he's now written a very astonishing article in the Daily Telegraph, Ben Wallace has done, which starts with Ukraine is winning, now let's finish the job. And he goes on to say, as the counteroffensive breaks down the Russian lines, Britain must make sure the West stands firm. And he says that things are going very well on the battlefield. Things may have been a little more slow than some people expected, but overall things are moving fully in the right direction. The Ukrainians rather, are advancing step by step, and they've got the Russians on the run. He then gave some fantastic figures for the number of losses that the Russians have suffered. He said Putin's army has lost more than 2,500 tanks, 6,500 armoured vehicles, and nearly 300,000 dead or injured. Not a single commander who led the major Russian units into Ukraine is still in place. Well, some of them have been rotated, but some of them self-evidently are still in place. But anyway, I'm not going to get into a debate about this. But then he goes on to say that the real problem is that some people appear to be looking for a pause. He says Putin is desperately grasping at the final two things that can save him: time and the splitting of the international community. And he goes on to say further on in the article, let us not pause for one day. Let us see this thing through. The world is watching to see if the West has the resolve to stand up for our values and the rule-based system. What we do now for Ukraine will set the direction for all of our security for years to come. So victory is in sight. We mustn't worry about freezes. He seems oblivious to the fact that the Russians have actually ruled out a freeze or a ceasefire. I discussed over a series of my recent videos how a series of Russian officials, Lavrov on 2 occasions, Shoigu, the Speaker of the Duma, Mr. Volodin, and of course Dmitry Medvedev, have all in effect categorically ruled out the idea of a freeze. But anyway, he seems to think that this is what Putin is desperate for. He wants a freeze, against completely in the face of what the Russians are actually saying. He wants a freeze, and he says, let us not pause for one day. Let us see this through. Things are going so well. The Russians have suffered these enormous losses. Their forces are clearly on the verge of collapse. Not a single commander who led a major Russian unit into Ukraine is still in place. So let's press on, and victory will be ours. He doesn't explain exactly how. And he does say that if we win this victory, well, the future of the rules-based system depends on it. The implication being that if we don't, then the rules-based system, in other words, the system of Western hegemony, will collapse. Over the course of this extraordinary article, Ben Wallace, who up to this time I have always regarded as a decent man, made a comment of, I thought, astonishing cruelty. And I will also add, by the way, that it contained in it the one nugget of information in Ben Wallace's article, which I did find interesting. The paragraph reads as follows. Ukraine can also play its part. The average age of the soldiers at the front is over 40. I understand President Zelensky's desire to preserve the young for the future, but the fact is that Russia is mobilizing the whole country by stealth. Putin knows a pause will hand him time to build a new army. So just as Britain did in 1939 and 1941, perhaps it is time to reassess the scale of Ukraine's mobilization. Notice again the invocations of the Second World War, the implication once again that Putin and Russia represent the same kind of threat that Germany did to the world at that time. But put that aside, let's just take a step back and consider what Ben Wallace is saying here. He says that the Ukrainian soldiers, the average age, notice he's talking about the average age of Ukrainian soldiers at the front is over 40. So all of these infantrymen, presumably, who are advancing, all those people who drive the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles, all of these people who have been sent to fight between Rabotino and Verbovoye, their average age now is over 40. And remember at a point earlier in the war, I think it was on the eve of Ukraine's offensives in Kharkiv, when the average age of Ukrainian troops, certainly in the battlefield brigades, the ones that carried out the offensive, their average age at that time was 27. Now, Ben Wallace says that the average age of the soldiers at the front, to use his words, is over 40. But this isn't because Ukraine has already run through the younger, fitter men in their 20s and 30s. He doesn't at any point acknowledge the reality of Ukraine's appalling casualties, even though there is now article after article in the media in the West that has acknowledged this fact. He says that the reason that there are older men, 40 and above, fighting on the battlefronts is because of President Zelensky's desire to preserve the young for the future. But he goes on to say that all restraints must be put aside. President Zelensky must conduct another massive mobilization. He must mobilize the whole country, because Putin is doing that in Russia, though by stealth. And he conjures up the memory of Britain's mobilizations of 1939 and 1941. But he wants all the men, including the young men, those young men that are left, and one wonders which age group he has in mind. Does he mean teenagers, students, and school children, for example? He wants them all to be mobilized, pulled into the Ukrainian army, and flung into the battlefronts to be killed in their hundreds and thousands every day, crossing the minefields, advancing into the artillery fire and the machine gun fire against the Russian forces in their fortified positions. That is what Ben Wallace is calling for in this article. And he is doing it, as he says himself, in order to stand up for our values, the West's values. Notice he's not talking about Ukraine's values and the rules-based order. That is what all of these young people, perhaps teenagers in many cases, are going to be asked to do. I have to say, I find that absolutely chilling. I find that one of the most appalling comments made by a Western official, or in Ben Wallace's case, ex-official, over the course of the war, that Ukraine is supposed to sacrifice what is left of its youth so that the West can secure the future of the rules-based system, to use Ben Wallace's choice of words. I do hope more and more people in Ukraine are paying attention to this, because, as I said, the callousness of this comment, frankly, leaves me almost speechless. But there we are. That's Ben Wallace. Let's move on from that terrible paragraph. The point is, there must be no pause, no freeze. We must continue to supply Ukraine with everything that we've got. I can't help but think that this article and those comments were made once it became known across the military and political system in Britain that Rishi Sunak had made a decision to backtrack on Grant Shapps' suggestions of the previous day. Now, in my opinion, Grant Shapps, when he spoke out, I think he was flying a kite. He was seeing, this is probably something that had been discussed within the British government. The British government is becoming increasingly concerned that the offensive is not succeeding. It's not achieved the breakthrough that many expected and many supposed. As Ben Wallace says, the function, what the British must now do is it must act in order to try to bolster Ukrainian support for Ukraine across the West, and that's basically what his article is suggesting. And I think the British government flew a kite. They proposed, in effect, to send troops into Ukraine to try to protect the grain ships in some way. And I think they did that looking to see how other countries in NATO, how the Americans would react, and how public opinion in Britain would react. And I think it became very clear very quickly that the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. European states are in no mood to send their own troops to fight in Ukraine. In the United States, that is absolutely not an option that the administration is prepared to countenance as the elections loom next year. And I suspect, by the way, that soundings that would have been taken in Britain as well will have quickly discovered, as soon as Grant Shapps made his comments, that British public opinion would be extremely negative, extremely hostile to the idea of British troops being sent to Ukraine, where they might become targets for the Russians and where they might find themselves in direct conflict with the Russians. So Rishi Sunak came out and he made the statements that he did after Medvedev made it absolutely clear that Russia's position on this was unbending and that this was not any kind of bluff. So Rishi Sunak backtracked, and for the moment at least, this whole idea has been dropped. And that in turn provoked the hardliners, people like Ben Wallace, to come out, make this extraordinary article saying that Britain must do more, that we must help Ukraine, to go back to his article, maintain its momentum, and this will require more munitions, ATACMS, and Storm Shadows, as if there was an unlimited number of these things. And the best way to keep the international community together is the demonstration of success. In other words, there must be a breakthrough. This is urgent. This is essential, because the war cannot be stopped, because if it was, well, the rules-based system would be in jeopardy, and Britain's position in it would be in jeopardy. So Ukraine must mobilize all the men it has left, and we must be prepared to do our bit, sending more munitions, ATACMS and Storm Shadows and whatever else we have. And obviously he can't go directly against the advice, the decision of the Prime Minister, because that would expose the extent of the conflict, which he's probably not prepared to do for the moment, and his backers within the British military and security establishment are probably not prepared to do that either. But anyway, that was probably what the original idea floated by Grant Shapps was about. Now, on the new Atlas, Brian Beletic has done what I consider to be one of his best programs, discussing the whole freeze idea, but also going into great detail about an interview given by Admiral Radakin, the current commander, overall commander of British forces, to War on the Rocks. And if you listen to that video, you see how Brian goes step by step through all the, frankly, outlandish claims and comments that Radakin makes, and he debunks them all. But the key thing to say is that Radakin makes many of the identical points that Ben Wallace makes in this same article. And I can't help but think that the two have been in some kind of touch. Of course, I don't know this for a fact, but that's how it looks to me. That was not directly, but maybe there's a whole group of people who are talking together, who are becoming increasingly alarmed by the drift of events. So Radakin went and spoke to War on the Rocks, gave his interview. Pressure was then put on Grant Shapps and on the British government to agree to the deployment of British troops to Ukraine. More, I suspect, in order to encourage escalation by others. And then when that idea was turned down, we had this follow-up by Ben Wallace, making essentially the same points as Radakin, but in some ways going further still. Now, I have to say once more that reading all of these comments, reading what listening, it's an audio interview, listening to what Radakin had to say, reading what Grant Shapps had to say, reading what Ben Wallace has to say, I think that the kindest way I can describe it is to say that in Britain we have taken leave of our senses. Our government, our political and military leaders are not only refusing to acknowledge the realities of what is actually happening in Ukraine, that Ukraine is on the brink of a major strategic defeat in this counteroffensive, that the Russians are on the brink of a major strategic victory. It is only this tantalizing rumor about a Ukrainian strike across the Dnieper that causes me to qualify that and say that this strategic victory by the Russians and strategic defeat by Ukraine has not already happened. I should say all the facts on the ground, the reduction in the fighting, all of that actually point to the offensive having effectively ended. But anyway, let's not commit ourselves to that. Anyway, the British, or at least a part of the British establishment, refuses to accept that. They retreat into denials. They criticise everybody who doesn't agree with them. And by the way, Ben Wallace has all kinds of things to say, all sorts of rude comments to make about all sorts of unnamed skeptics who spoke about Ukraine's defeat at the start of the war. And as is often the way, he valorizes Ukrainian soldiers and talks about how rapidly they learn to understand and assimilate Western weapons and Western training. This after dozens of articles have appeared, including, by the way, in the Ukrainian media, about the problems Ukraine is having maintaining these weapons and operating them, and the inadequacies of Western training, including, by the way, British training. But never mind, all of that Ben Wallace brushes away. He criticises the skeptics, he criticises the doubters. He says we must maintain momentum, we must keep going, and we must keep going, and forget about freeze or pause. We must not pause for a single day. Now, of course, for Ukraine, this is disastrous. And can I say, going back to that terrible paragraph in Ben Wallace's article about Ukraine mobilizing its remaining young people, I find it astonishing that an ex-official in one country should be telling the president of an entirely different country that he must be prepared to sacrifice his country's youth. As I said, I find it astonishing that he does that. But look what this advice is doing to Ukraine when the Russian Defense Minister, Shoigu, said a few days ago at that Defense Ministry board meeting, which I discussed also in a program that I made a few days ago, that the West is leading Ukraine up the path to self-destruction. Well, you can see that set out in black and white in this article that Ben Wallace has written. But that, of course, is about Ukraine. What is this doing for Britain? Well, at one level, it is further weakening and depleting our armed forces. We're not very fully stocked with weapons anymore. Apparently all our self-propelled guns have gone to Ukraine. A significant part of our operative tanks have also gone to Ukraine also. And by the way, I've come across a piece which was sent to me by a member of the Duran community. It's a video, actually, which makes it fairly clear that Ukrainian soldiers are not especially impressed by the Challenger 2. They think little of it. In fact, a much stronger word was used. Just saying. But anyway, we've depleted and weakened our armed forces. We've triggered an economic war, which is taking a significant toll in Britain itself. But by taking this hardline, extreme position, which it seems to me owes more to emotion than any kind of calculation, I see no sign of any proper calculation or analysis in any of these comments, either the ones by Radikin or the ones by Grant Shapps or the ones by Ben Wallace. By taking these extreme positions, we are exposing ourselves in Britain. We are not only alienating the Russians, but we're making the entire global south regard us with, dare I say, the most intense skepticism. Again, I'm being very measured in my use of words, and I suspect that before long, we're going to be seen as an embarrassment and a problem even by some of our own NATO allies. Now that brings me to what's going on in other places. We've just had this election in Slovakia. Now there's been a lot of commentary about it, about Robert Fico, and I think that is the correct way to pronounce his name. My apologies if I have mispronounced it in previous programs. It looks most likely now that he is going to be Slovakia's Prime Minister. And I think that it should be said that he has won, contrary to what I've seen some say, what looks to me like a solid victory. Now, Fico has been Prime Minister of Slovakia in the past. Some years ago, I believe it was in 2018, there were big protests against him in Slovakia over the death of a journalist. He was supposedly blamed for this. He was connected to it in some way that I was never able to understand. And of course, there were lots of allegations of corruption. And besides, he was deeply unpopular with the political leadership, the EU leadership in Brussels, and the leaders of the major Western states. He was seen as too pro-Russian. He claims to be a social democrat. His party has its roots in the former Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and that already would make him a suspect person in some eyes. And he's also perceived as being pro-Russian. This despite the fact that I understand that in Slovakia itself, economically speaking, he ran a tight and effective ship. Just saying. But anyway, Fico has been called a populist, criticised in all kinds of ways. And what happened over the course of those protests was that his party split, breakaway faction, which appears to follow very much the same kind of social democratic ideology as Fico's own party, anyway, broke away and established itself as a separate party. And of course, the pro-Western Liberal Progressive Party then became the governing party in Slovakia. But what has happened in this election, an election which Fico seems to have largely fought on the basis of his opposition to the Progressive Party government's wholehearted support for Ukraine and for the war. Anyway, what has happened is that the Progressive Party has fallen to just 18% of the vote. There was, by the way, an exit poll that was widely published in the Western media as the polling stations closed, which actually suggested that the Progressive Party might actually be on the brink of winning the elections. Well, they didn't win the elections. They managed to come second, but with just 18% of the vote. Fico and his part of the Social Democratic Party came top with 24.5% of the vote. But importantly, the party that emerged as a result of the split of the Fico-led Social Democratic Party during the previous protests, it came third with 15% of the vote. And it is widely assumed, and the leader of this party, Mr. Pellegrini, has, to all intents and purposes, said as much, that this third party will go back into coalition with Fico. In other words, these two parties, which were previously one party, will come together and will reform in effect and establish a government. And if you put the votes of these two parties together, well, then we can see that the primary forces that the two big parties, the two big blocs that will form Fico's coalition, and which were once both wings, each wings of his party, well, taken together, they won almost 40% of the vote, which makes, of course, the victory seem a lot more impressive. There is a third party about which I know extremely little, but apparently it is, in this instance, straightforwardly pro-Russian, or at least that's what the reports say, and it is likely to be the coalition partner which will give Fico a solid majority in the new parliament. A majority, not a big one, but certainly enough to make him prime minister and to secure his position as prime minister. So, what has happened is that Europe has witnessed the first election in which the war in Ukraine has been a leading issue, one of the main topics, and the result has been a victory for a political leader widely disliked within the European Union, who has campaigned on extricating his country, Slovakia, from the war in Ukraine. He's repeated since the election that his policy remains the same as the one he campaigned on. There will be no more equipment sent from Slovakia to Ukraine. And I understand, by the way, that Slovakia does have some kind of an arms industry. So that would be that isn't just a position, a principal position. It is an actual, real one. There would have been weapons continued to be sent by if the previous government had been re-elected. Fico will ensure that no more weapons are sent. And secondly, Fico has said that he's going to work round the clock to get some kind of negotiations, some kind of peace negotiated and up and running. In making all of these comments, Fico is increasingly sounding like the leader of Slovakia's neighbouring country, Hungary, Viktor Orban. And of course, Viktor Orban has congratulated Fico on his victory And it does look as if these two leaders, these two political leaders, one essentially leading a party that positions itself as being on the left, that's Fico, and the other leading a party that positions itself very much on the Christian right, that being Orban, that on this issue, and indeed on several others, they're preparing to make common cause. It means that Hungary is no longer as isolated in Europe in its opposition to Western policies in support of the war and in support of Ukraine that it has been up to this point. And overshadowing everything, there is this election in Poland. And again, if we go back to the British media, there's been a worried article about the election in Poland by our old friend Simon Tisdall in The Guardian. Again, he couches it as Poland being on the slippery slope to dictatorship if the Law and Justice Party wins re-election, as it is looking increasingly likely that it will. But of course, the thing that is unnerving, not just Simon Tisdall, but other people in Britain, is that there has been this major break between the leadership of Law and Justice and the Ukrainian government, between, in other words, the Polish government and the government of Ukraine. And it seems likely that Law and Justice, in order to retain power, will have to go into coalition with another party that has only recently emerged in Poland, but which is much more outspoken about its opposition to Poland's further involvement in this conflict in Ukraine. Now, I will say that for the British, they have been consistently counting on Poland's support as they have worked to rally European opinion to the cause of Ukraine. If Poland were to reverse course and were to make common cause with Hungary and Slovakia, well, that would be a massive shock for the British, and they would see it as a major political defeat. But overshadowing everything are the events in the United States. Now, I think these have been widely misunderstood in Europe, where I think many people do not understand the mechanics of the American political system very well. First thing to say is that Congress has not blocked funding for Ukraine. On the contrary, it is very likely that a package of funding for Ukraine will be approved by Congress at some point over the next few weeks. What happened was that the Biden administration, in agreement with the leaders of the Republican Party in Congress, especially in the Senate, decided to attach a $24 billion aid package for Ukraine to a larger budget appropriation, which Congress was asked to approve, which would have kept the US government running. And the reason that was done was not because failing to do it in this way would have resulted in Congress voting down funding for Ukraine. There is a substantial majority of in Congress, both I think in the House of Representatives and even more in the Senate, that continues to support funding for Ukraine. The reason it was done in this way was because the Biden administration and the Republican leadership in Congress did not want to highlight the fact that opposition to the war amongst Republicans, especially in the House of Representatives, is growing. So the idea was put it all together in one package. It's all voted through. The split in the Republican Party, which is, of course, a split in the support of the political class for Ukraine, can that way be papered over and concealed. It's that ploy which has now fallen apart. We will have a spending package for Ukraine. Probably it will be of the same order of magnitude as the $24 billion that the administration was looking for. But there will now be a straight vote on it, both in the Senate and in the House, and that will make clear that there is a large body, nobody knows quite how large, but the sense is that it is substantial, that there is a large body of Republicans in the House who are opposed to continued funding for Ukraine, and that there is a significant, though smaller, body of Republicans in the Senate, people like J.D. Vance, for example, who oppose funding for Ukraine also. So this is going to highlight the divisions in the United States. Now, in and of itself, this might not be a serious problem because the administration, as I said, still has enough support in Congress to get funding for Ukraine passed. What the administration is worried about, what the Republican leadership in Congress is worried about, is that if there is a vote by a significant number of Republicans against funding for Ukraine, as is now likely to happen, the taboo on discussing this topic, which has existed up to now, will be broken and it will become an issue over the course of next year's election. And that, of course, is something that the administration and those who support the conflict in Ukraine and who support the administration's policies do not want to see happen, given that public opinion in the United States is running strongly now. Well, the mood at least has shifted against continued support for Ukraine. They do not want it to become, they do not want the topic of funding for Ukraine to become an election issue, because they know that funding for Ukraine is increasingly unpopular, with probably by now a majority of American voters. Now, I'm not fully sure how much of this is understood in Britain. I doubt that British politicians, people like Ben Wallace, understand the very complicated American political system at all well. But having said that, they will be looking at these battles in Washington with growing concern. They will be aware of the fact that just as the election in Slovakia has shown that doubts about the war are growing in Eastern Europe, and the coming elections in Poland might highlight that even further, so doubts in the United States are growing as well. Thus all the talk about a freeze, even as the offensive, of course, has failed to achieve the results predicted of it. So that's why Britain, parts of the British leadership, are experiencing what you might call a nervous breakdown. Now, Saying all of this, we come back to the fundamental problem. The administration, Western governments, have no policy for ending the war. Their idea to get some kind of ceasefire in place and freeze the conflict is unacceptable to the Russians. The Russians are becoming increasingly confident. They feel that they've seen off the worst of Ukraine's offensive. If Ukraine wasn't able to launch a successful amphibious assault across the Dnieper in June or July or August, when Ukrainian forces were stronger, it seems unlikely that they can succeed with such an operation today. So the Russians are getting increasingly confident, and they're talking about Ukraine either capitulating or facing its destruction as a state. And there's probably one particular factor which I've not spoken about until now, which is probably heightening Russian confidence. This is that there are now more and more reports about Ukrainian soldiers deserting and defecting to the Russians. Now, it's very difficult to give an objective assessment to this. One has to be very careful that one isn't falling for the propaganda that each side publishes over the course of this conflict, and all of the talk about deserters, large numbers of deserters coming over to the Russian side, of course, comes exclusively from the Russians. But my gradual sense is that this is indeed taking place. The Russians claim that up to 11,000 Ukrainians have crossed over and given themselves up over the course of September, which would be a significant number if true. And I can't verify or corroborate it. But anyway, suffice to say that it looks to me to be a great deal more than a trickle, which is what it looked like a few months ago. It's not yet a flood, but it is perhaps a pointer, an indicator of where things on the battlefields are going. Given which, why would the Russians negotiate when they sense that the situation is working in their favor and that if they persist, they will achieve victory? It's not as if the Western powers are proposing anything that would persuade them to change their minds. The best that the West can offer is a ceasefire and a freezing of the conflict, which the Russians have already made clear is unacceptable. So, the divide that is starting to emerge in the United States and perhaps in Europe is not between those who are truly seeking a negotiated settlement, but between those who want to continue supporting the war, who want to continue supporting Ukraine, and those who don't. Within the administration, as between Sullivan and Blinken on the one hand, and Nuland and company on the other, there might be talk about a freeze. As we've seen, Ben Wallace alludes to it, and he's extremely nervous about it. But in the real world, that discussion has no traction. The only discussion that matters, the only discussion that is going to gain traction is between those in the United States and increasingly in Europe who want to sustain support for Ukraine at as close to existing levels as possible, and those who don't and who are prepared to call off the whole affair. We are, or so it seems to me, at the start, finally, of a genuine discussion about this war and about what the options really are, though it is a discussion which still doesn't seem to be including the Russians to any real extent. One side wants to continue the war, the other side basically accepts that the war is lost, even if they can't quite bring themselves to say it, that the war is lost and that the time has come to move away. No wonder those European political leaders, the British, the German leadership, probably Macron in France, Meloni in Italy, who's also, I understand, coming under increasing pressure. No wonder all of them are becoming increasingly nervous, and no wonder we see these signs in Britain of stress. Well, that's where I leave my programme today. More from me soon. All that remains is for me to remind you that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, checking out our various things there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And, well, this is where I end. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.